Okay, howdy, Hags. We are back for another edition of Exercise Biomechanics. Today, we're going to be focusing, first of all, we're going to finish up our discussion about skeletal muscle, and then we're going to start our section on bone, which will occupy pretty much all of the week in terms of lecture. So we'll get started. Should be a really good session today. Notice we're actually going to start off by talking about space flight and immobilization. So any type of radical unloading, meaning what we do is we take a limb and either put someone in a plaster cast, or maybe someone is bedridden. People, for example, one of the problems with COVID-19 is with hospitalization and being bedridden for a while, you can have significant loss of skeletal muscle mass, especially for someone in an ICU. In an ICU, it's kind of double trouble because not only do you lose limb mass, but when someone's on a ventilator, because your diaphragm muscle, your primary inspiratory muscle, is active all of the time, that means that muscle gets weak on the ventilator. And that's a real problem in terms of weaning off. So obviously we'd like to prevent that if possible. And also doctors are trying to find the right type of medication that will ameliorate some of the problems. There's a cytokine inhibitor or two that may be working, fingers crossed, when someone is in an ICU, and get them off the ventilator fast. If you have to be on, you want to be off of it and breathing on your own as quickly as possible. So what the drug should be able to do, we hope, is to reduce the cytokines. It's something called a cytokine storm. Normally, cytokines are really important in terms of healing, repair, and even muscle hypertrophy and increases in bone mass. We see them with a little spike after each exercise bout. But what we'd like to see is them basically returning back to normal. With a cytokine storm, they just kind of get out of control as your immune system kind of overwhelms the ability of the lungs to be able to repair themselves. And instead of spurring repair, they actually inhibit repair. So they get out of that Goldilocks zone and get too high. So anyway, there's a couple of drugs that are inhibitors of IL-6, that's interleukin 6, that may work. We'll see. And hopefully, in not too long, maybe 6 months. That doesn't sounds like a long time now, doesn't it? Maybe 6 months we'll have a vaccine. So fingers crossed. We'll see how things go there. So with immobilization, something really interesting happens. We just mentioned a moment ago that during exercise, you get a spike in cytokines. You also get a spike in inflammatory signaling and oxidative stress. So you'd figure with immobilization, space flight, being bedridden, that you see just the opposite in the diaphragm muscle and your limb muscles. But that's not what we see. We actually see high levels of oxidative stress, high levels of inflammatory proteins. So we think that the muscle is basically trying to remodel and basically change what it's doing. And in this case, if muscles are unloaded for a period of time, it's basically after about 2 days to 3 days, a long weekend where you're either off your feet, your body is thinking, well, you know what, you may be sick or you may be injured. In that case, your intake for amino acids and proteins is probably not high enough. So I'm going to tear down your bones and muscles to be able to provide amino acids for substrate, and also for energy, because your brain can only work on glucose. Your body will actually use amino acids from muscles and bones and produce glucose from that in the liver. That process is called gluconeogenesis. So with spaceflight, with being bedridden or in an ICU, immobilization, what we see is rapid loss of skeletal muscle mass. And that is done through an increase in protein degradation and reduction in protein synthesis. So with that imbalance, what happens is the muscles lose mass. But there are other morphological changes as well. There's an increase in connective tissue. So the muscle actually gets a little bit more fibrotic. It's a little surprising that that would happen, but it's probably that enhanced inflammatory and oxidative stress signaling that goes up and just stays up. There's decreased elasticity. Some of that is due to the increased connective tissue. There's also, not surprisingly, atrophy, decrease in muscle cross-sectional area as protein degradation is overcoming protein synthesis, which is decreasing. There's actually a fiber type shift from slow twitch to fast twitch. It's not complete, it's partial, but it's there and seems to be real. We think that fast twitch fibers are easier to maintain, believe it or not. They cost less energy to be able to maintain. Type 2 fibers or fibers like that were around first. You find them, a lot of them in something like it in frogs and something like it in lizards, and a lot of birds, of course, have a lot of fast twitch fibers in their wings. So type 2 fibers or fast twitch fibers, they're easier to maintain. It doesn't cost as much energy, as I mentioned, to be able to keep them up. And it's just easier to get amino acids from red fibers. It doesn't mean that type 2 fibers don't atrophy. With spaceflight, they do, and especially in humans. And you see loss of type 2 fibers and reduction in fiber cross-sectional area. In type 2 fibers in an ICU unit or after someone's been casted, for example. Because you have an increased connective tissue, and believe it or not, sometimes the fat content's a little bit higher, the quality of the muscle is decreased. And what we mean there is that the ability to produce force per cross-sectional area is down. So the muscles are atrophying, so they produce less total force, but they also produce less force per cross-sectional area. So indeed, it's a big problem. And I mentioned a few moments ago that there's a fiber type shift from type 1 to type 2 fibers. It's not a large shift, but indeed it is real. One of the ways we determine that, we can determine it basically two ways. One is to look at the myosin heavy chain. Those are the myosin molecules. They're fast twitch myosin heads. There's slow twitch myosin heads. There's stains to do that. There's some older school stains that we've used in the past that allow us to take advantage of the fact that the ATPase for slow twitch and fast twitch fibers is either labile, in other words, it's sensitive to pH. So for example, at low pH, the fast twitch fibers, the ATPase becomes inactive, so it doesn't stain as well. So here we see, this is a soleus muscle, which is almost all slow twitch fibers. At a low pH or acidic pH, this is a control group. This is disuse or a spaceflight model, and here's a magic drug that we use to be able to deal with that. What we see is these are fast twitch fibers right in here. Here's some more of them. The ones that are stained kind of in the middle of the type 2Bs, those are technically the white fibers. It's a little counterintuitive because the stain works kind of the opposite of what we see in terms of the muscle fiber itself. The type 2As, which are technically pink fibers, they stain here white because at a low pH, the ATPase activity is just, it's gone. And at an alkaline pH, the type 1 fibers, the ATPase there is quiescent. It's not really doing its job, so which is okay in terms of the stain. So the type 2 fibers are going to stain dark blue. And notice we've got a lot more of these fast twitch or type 2 fibers. And that was ameliorated by this magic drug that we may talk about later at some point. Okay, so let's talk about traumatic muscle injuries and then material fatigue injuries. And the material fatigue injury, everybody out there's experienced it at one time or another, oftentimes a lot. I was working in the yard this weekend and got a little sore myself. So muscle strain, a pull muscle, what's that? That's a traumatic injury where you have a very large load, and it's usually with a large eccentric contraction, except the load is much higher than we usually see. So usually the injury is right near the myotendinous junction, the myotendinous junction. So at the myotendinous junction, what we see is this concentration of force where you have a muscle with a large belly, and that muscle's cross-sectional area is shrinking as it's coming into the tendon. So at that myotendinous junction, we actually see a significant amount of mechanical stress. So that's why when the muscle's pulling really hard, you can have an injury right near the myotendinous junction. By the way, that's where the Golgi tendon organs are, and they have a reflex, if you will, that reduces the amount of force that's produced by the agonist muscle. Okay, so we've got a muscle that's strained or pulled. We have three classes, class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 1 is a very mild sprain where a small number of fibers have been torn. That injury, again, is at the myotendinous junction or very near there. A class 2 sprain is a partial tear. So that may take a little longer to heal because we've got to replace the connective tissue as well as heal those muscle fibers. A muscle tear, class 3 strain with the T, is a very large, it occurs with a large mechanical stress. Not surprisingly, a lot of pulled muscles happen with the hamstrings group because it doesn't stretch very much during the course of the day. So a little unusual for skeletal muscles. Okay, so let's go now to delayed onset muscle soreness. Everybody has experienced this. It's where we have repeated eccentric contractions. And so the intensity level is moderate to large, but not nearly as large as we see with a muscle strain. And it's usually where you have a task and exercise that's relatively new, or you haven't done in a while, or you've increased your volume, whether it's resistor training, or whether it's bowling, or yard work, or tennis, or golf, whatever you happen to be doing. Let's say you've been exercising, running outside, or maybe you've been cooped up for a while, and then you go do something, maybe you try some yoga, and you find, ooh, 24, 48 hours, you're really super sore. Now, one of the interesting things about delayed onset muscle soreness is that the injury is not delayed. It happens right away. So you may not feel the soreness and pain right away, but your muscles are affected and they actually don't contract as hard. They can't produce as much active tension. And that's because excitation contraction coupling is disrupted. There are actually small tears around the cell membrane. Calcium rushes in. There can be some oxidative stress, but we think calcium is mediating this initial injury, and then the calcium leakage actually leads to delayed injury and loss of muscle force. So there are two phases of loss of skeletal muscle force. One is initially with the injury, and then also about 1 to 2 days later, we see a secondary phase of loss of muscle mass. When this happens, calcium's also involved. It activates proteases called activates proteases called calpains, and then there's another type called ubiquitin system. Both of these systems are involved in basically taking the muscle. It actually unzippers the Z line, goes to work on the actin and myosin, digests it, turns it into amino acids so that the body can use it as needed. With delayed onset muscle soreness, that injury is fairly acute. It again occurs with repeated eccentric or lengthening contractions. So we have a model that kind of describes these two phases with repeated eccentric contractions. One of the things to be clear about with delayed onset muscle soreness, first of all, the location of the injury is not the same as a muscle strain. A muscle strain, the injury is largely focused near the myotendinous junction. With delayed onset muscle soreness, it's scattered all through the muscle. Individual sarcomeres get damaged, So you may see every other sarcomere in a fiber get damaged. The next fiber has a few sarcomeres damaged, but other sarcomeres, even in the same fiber, are not being affected. So when people have done calcium stains to look at it, you get these hot spots, which actually look pretty cool. There's a disruption immediately of the cell membrane, probably near the cytoskeleton. So if there's a mechanical injury that gets amplified by calcium again, there's an effect on excitation, contraction, coupling. So that contributes to this early decrease in force production. That means if you're doing an exercise or you're coaching and you know that your players or you are going to be sore in a day or two, it also means you can't produce as much force. Now, so your performance will be down. Not only that, it means that your body may be more susceptible to an injury. This is often when people get injured, fairly early in practice, the first few days when a coach is really pushing someone. So one of the things if you're preparing for practice or an event and you're just getting started, you probably want to actually prepare for practice for practice, if you will, especially if you're concerned about an injury. And the reason being, let's say you're really getting pushed and it's late in practice or late in a game, then you want to make sure that you're careful and you don't potentially injure an ankle, knee, fracture a bone, etc. So you're susceptible to all kinds of orthopedic or sports medicine related injuries when you have delayed onset muscle soreness. A muscle damage by delayed onset muscle soreness will undergo about a 14-day genetic program to repair itself. This also happens when you're doing weightlifting. It actually helps to stimulate, for example, the early phase of protein synthesis, which is going to lead potentially to hypertrophy. In this case, we're just trying to repair the muscle itself. There's an increase in calcium, which again can turn on proteases like calpains, ubiquitin that we just mentioned, and that contributes to this decreased force development that's that late phase. You also get an increase in white blood cells, which include macrophages. We talked about M1 and M2 macrophages. That leads to inflammation. Inflammation is two phases. The M1 macrophages are involved in tearing out the old protein. M2 macrophages are building up the new protein so that the muscle can repair itself. And that's going to be stimulated by growth factors like insulin-like growth factor. Platelet-derived growth factor is going to guide that. They're associated, believe it or not, with the M2 macrophages. So the M2 macrophage is a building macrophage. The M1 is a tearing down macrophage. The inflammation can contribute directly or indirectly to the soreness. So if you're sore, it's not really necessarily a bad thing. The muscle is going to be repairing itself. And it's going to do so in a coordinated fashion. The problem with muscular dystrophy, if you can imagine, is delayed onset muscle soreness, where all the muscle fibers are in a different part of that genetic repair program. With normal delayed onset muscle soreness, most of the fibers in that muscle that are sore are being repaired at just about the same rate. That's really important, believe it or not, because the muscle cells communicate with each other. And as we see when we talk about bone, the muscles also communicate with the bone. And there's really good evidence the muscles, when they're contracting and exercising, also communicate with the brain. This tissue-to-tissue communication is well beyond what we normally thought about in terms of hormones. So this is beyond hormones. Some of those communication routes involve something called microRNA, which has become a really hot area of research. That's part of what we call epigenetics, meaning stuff that regulates gene function indirectly. Okay, so the muscles can get sore. The inflammation isn't a bad thing, it's a good thing. In fact, if we're starting like a weightlifting program, that soreness, that inflammation is not a bad sign at all. It actually means we're going to crank up protein synthesis, but what we have to do is continue to do resistive training. So you need that mechanical stress 2 or 3 days a week, with a high enough intensity. That bar needs to be about 70% of your 1 repetition max, your 1 rep max. There we go. Okay, very briefly, overuse syndrome. You may feel lethargy right now. I know the feeling. My neighbor was talking to me from 7 feet away. And we're asking, he saw me doing some yard work, and we were trying to remember which day. Because weekends now and weekdays are kind of blending together, except I sort of have a thing about when I do my lectures, usually on Mondays and Tuesdays, so that you guys get them by Wednesday morning. That's how I remember what day of the week it is, besides emails and my iCalendar. So if you're feeling a little lethargy, it's probably, well, maybe overuse syndrome. If you've been getting out there and getting in the sun, maybe exercising, maybe taking your frustrations out, if maybe you're doing some resistor training inside, maybe you have some weights. But with overuse syndrome, what happens is the muscles are seeing too much stress. They can't quite keep up. So even though protein synthesis is up because those muscles are sore, either the volume or intensity or both are too much. This often happens to people playing sports. For example, pitchers in the major leagues, they often see it's overuse syndrome. And when that happens, because of the extra stress on the muscles, your body starts producing more connective tissue. The endomysium gets thicker, the paramecium gets thicker. And that seems like a good thing at first because you're trying to manage the stress and trying to protect the muscles from being damaged, but it reduces the quality of the muscles. The increased amount of connective tissue reduces the amount of flexibility, reduces the elastic recoil, also reduces the amount of force that the muscle can produce per cross-sectional area. So reduced range of motion. Most pitchers have very large range of motion in terms of lateral and medial rotation. But with overuse syndrome, what we see is a reduced range of motion, muscle weakness, there's chronic oxidative stress and inflammation. There we go. Oxidative stress and inflammation. And as I mentioned, increased connective tissue, collagen. Well, you guys know about bruises. We'll skip that one. And I think that actually will do it in terms of skeletal muscle mechanics. So a quick 1-minute break, and then I'll be back from your perspective about 3 seconds. And we'll start bone mechanics. Okay, howdy, Ags, we're back. So the rest of the week in terms of lecture, we're going to be focusing on bones, bone function, and bone biomechanics. So it's a really exciting area. There's been a lot of research over the past really 30 to 40 to 50 years on bones dealing with exercise, rehabilitation, osteoporosis, etc. A lot of exciting stuff going on. So if this slide looks a little different, the notes I've been updating for skeletal muscle, for mechanotransduction, for mechanical stress strain curves, bones, they're all now updated on eCampus. So feel free to take a look and grab updated versions. I'm trying to update these slides as I go along. Partly what I'm trying to do is because of the nature of these classes online, I've got to change the flavor a little bit, add some pictures because I don't have a blackboard, or the whiteboard situation I discovered is really weird on Zoom, or at least I haven't figured out how to fix it yet, because you get a mirror image. And it would take me too long to write stuff in mirror image. That would be good practice to do, but I don't think I'm going to make a habit of that. All right, bone function. Bones do a lot of different stuff. They're critically important in support. They're also important in protection. The cranium protects the brain. The ribs protect the heart, the lungs, other types of internal organs. In biomechanics, it's really important for us to think about many of the bones of the body as rigid levers. that can rotate about an axis, producing torque. And that is what human movement's all about. When we talked about the secret of human movement, that was kind of the key. So if we think about a lever system and a muscle producing a force, we can divide that force into rotary and stabilizing components. Bones also have other functions. They're a great resource in terms of producing blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, white blood cells, including monocytes, macrophages, neutrophils, other types of leukocytes. They got lots of stem cells. So stem cells from all over the body come from the bone marrow. There are two sources. There's a mesenchymal type of source, and then there's a hemopoietic type of source. So like macrophages are related to mesenteric, and then the hemopoietic, that would be like your red blood cells or platelets, for example. So as we go through this, you'll see a little bit more about stem cells and where they come from, because they often come from your bones, and they either immediately or sometimes they're transported as part of your immune system. So that's really, really super cool, is that your immune system is basically involved in transporting or being some form of progenitor cell that eventually will end up in fat tissue or muscle or the liver or brain or the heart. The stem cells or progenitor cells in the heart, they come from the bone marrow. And that story is interesting. I think I mentioned it, that there was a man who needed a heart transplant, and the heart came from a woman. This was done at the New York University Medical School. And what they found when this person passed away, and they did an autopsy, is that some of the 23rd chromosomes, they weren't all XX. One was XY. Did I get it right? Didn't look right. Okay. Wait a minute. That's better. Nah, that's not. Okay. So XY, meaning somehow some male cells that snuck into the female heart. And they discovered later on that those were stem cells, and they had come originally from the bone marrow. So bone marrow is where we produce platelets, erythrocytes, leukocytes, all kinds of stem cells. The red marrow, the medullary cavity is red marrow in children and in most animals, mammals. But in adults, most of the red marrow is actually in cancellous bone in the non-mineralized area. Okay, function of bones. Again, calcium storehouse. That's not a surprise. 98% of the calcium in your body is stored in bones. That's basically the calcium bank, just like your muscles and also the bone or your amino acid bank. Fat, unfortunately, is your basic energy bank. It's a reservoir to maintain calcium. Your blood maintains calcium at about 5 milliequivalents. So we're really careful about calcium concentrations. And that's because your body has to regulate calcium really tightly. Tighter than sodium, tighter than potassium, tighter than chloride, believe it or not. So calcium needs to be at the right level so that the heart will beat. Heart cannot beat without external calcium. Your brain, your muscles, virtually every cell in the body needs calcium in order to function correctly. So remember, bones are dynamic. They're undergoing remodeling. They're constantly turning over protein and minerals. So the net content is that balance between protein and mass or mineral gain versus protein and mass and mineral loss. So that's basically the balance that we have to deal with. And that's primarily affected by mechanical stress. How much mechanical stress is there? That in turn is regulated, or it's modified by hormone levels, prostaglandins, cytokines, nitric oxide. There's all kinds of things involved in helping to regulate this remodeling process. So when there's mechanical loading on a mineralized bone, there's mechanotransduction, meaning that the bones pick up the signal It could be proteoglycans. It could be, for example, integrins on the cell membrane. It could be fibronectin. It could be nitric oxide synthase, detecting changes in mechanotransduction through fluid shear, for example, around the cell membrane, or increased calcium levels. That's one of the ways they pick up mechanical stress. Or it could be loads on the cytoskeleton, or inflammation. So there's a number of mechanisms involved there. Osteocytes, osteoclasts, and osteoblasts pick up that information, and they regulate, therefore, the amount of protein degradation. That's what osteoclasts do. They're involved in resorption. And then osteoblasts come behind and are involved in, of course, protein synthesis. The osteocytes regulate osteoclasts and osteoblasts, but they can also produce protein as well. So this process of remodeling is guided by different cells in bones, but they work together. So macrophages can communicate with osteoclasts and osteoblasts to enhance the remodeling process. Osteoclasts usually come in first and digest old protein and minerals. Osteoblasts come behind and build up new and better protein. So in terms of detecting mechanical stress and mechanotransduction, bones have a piezoelectric effect. We don't know the mechanism yet, how that works. Loads on the cytoskeleton, nitric oxide synthase, fluid shear and blood vessels on the bone itself, on the cytoskeleton. We also have, I'm going to put in calcium and a little inflammation. That also can be a mechanism of enhancement of nitric oxide synthase. Inflammation can produce a number of chemicals, including prostaglandins. And when there's damage, micro damage, or even traumatic injury, that, of course, is going to increase protein synthesis. Movement of blood and interstitial fluid causes fluid shear stress. The cell is able to pick that up, and we think that's one of the main mechanisms of mechanotransduction, of picking up mechanical stress. That, in turn, is going to enhance growth factors like insulin-like growth factor, transforming growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, platelet-derived growth factor. That's important as well. So these, in a sense, are what's going to guide this increased protein synthesis. It's going to be mostly collagen, and then laying down more minerals. So long bones, for example, it's a femur, are constructed like this, where we have an epiphysis. In the epiphysis, we're going to have mostly cancellous or trabecular bone. The diaphysis or shaft is going to have mostly compact bone. Compact bone is heavy. It doesn't have the metabolism that's as high as cancellous bone. It adapts, but not as fast as cancellous bone. So notice where we have cancellous bone, the ends of the bones, it's a bit wider. Even though the material is not as dense, it's wider and bigger. That allows at a joint or articulation a greater contact area. Also, the bone in this area is more responsive to exercise training. It's also more responsive, unfortunately, to casting, spaceflight, aging. This, again, the neck of the femur, that's where we can have large shear forces. And with a loss of bone mass and a reduction in ductility, that's where fractures can occur. That's where a hip fracture occurs. Right in here, not on your iliac crest. Around or on the top of articulating bones will be articular cartilage. There's a layer of subchondral bone, which is like an ossified cartilage that you might see in children, but you do see it in adults right on the top of where this bone might insert. There's a layer of hyaline cartilage right on top of that as well. So again, here we see the humerus. You can see that cancellous bone, that spongy bone. It's not as dense. It's not as strong. but it's more metabolically active, Cortical bone that you see in the shaft is denser, it's heavier. You might ask, well, why not make everything out of cortical bone? Well, first of all, it doesn't adapt as fast, so it might be more susceptible to a really bad injury. Plus, it would make your skeleton really heavy and it'd be hard to move around. Your ribs would, boy, you'd have trouble breathing because your ribs would be so stiff. You need that cartilage in the ribs, as well as a cancellous type of bone to allow it to be able to extend and breathe. Okay, bones by mass composition, 15 to 20% water. Water has surprisingly important material or mechanical properties, mostly ductility. It's a way to get nutrients around when there's not enough blood flow. Bones have a fair amount of blood flow, but not as much as a muscle or the heart or your brain or the liver. 70% of a bone mass is made of minerals, 5 to 10% is organic. It's not very much, but that's where collagen, laminin, proteoglycans come in. And proteoglycans, along with water, we think are really important in providing kind of a gel-like fluid situation in bones that actually increase ductility and also increase the toughness of the bone. The mineral content is made up of what we call hydroxyapatite. Those are crystals made of calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. So calcium phosphate, I was looking for an example. I don't have a seashell with me. So a seashell or a bird shell is made of calcium carbonate. It's a stiff material, it's strong, but it's fairly brittle. So you actually need collagen and the minerals coming together to give bones its strength, its stiffness, and its toughness, especially against bending forces and compression. Water in the bone matrix turns out to be incredibly important. Most of it's in a gel-like state, and it's bound to collagen, even the minerals, believe it or not, and proteoglycans. This bound water content turns out to be really important. With aging, the bound water that's bound to proteoglycans, et cetera, decreases, partly because proteoglycan levels are decreased. When there's not enough blood flow, you need diffusion of oxygen and nutrients to get supplies to the cell. So it's like a backup system. When you exercise, you get what I call this mechanical action of movement. So believe it or not, even though your bones are really stiff, they compress and stretch and bend and twist when people are exercising, when they're running, when they're playing tennis, when they're maybe hitting a volleyball, spiking a volleyball and jumping up and landing. You're going to see significant amount of deformation. It's not going to be large because the bones are really stiff and really strong, but it's going to be there. And we think that moves this gel-like fluid, aqueous fluid around that is kind of in, it's not really like jello, it's more like a gel, if you will. So it can kind of flow, but it's really thick and kind of viscous. So the interaction with proteoglycans, glycoproteins form this cement that also stabilizes bone. So it does help with the strength. When you put collagen and minerals together, the strength is actually greater than the sum of the strength of collagen and the strength of the minerals. So there's an interactive or synergistic effect. Mechanical stress and strain is picked up by proteoglycans in bones and tendons and ligaments, cartilage as well. And maybe even skeletal muscle, even though I haven't seen much literature on that. So we mentioned that this water is in kind of a bound state, and it's bound to proteoglycans. These are just different types of proteoglycans, aggrecan, versican. We're going to see those in tendons and ligaments as well. And they're going to be involved in repair in tendons, ligaments, and bones when there's damage or increasing protein synthesis over time. So water's bound to minerals, it's bound to collagen, it's bound to proteoglycans, and it looks like, again, in the bound state, it's healthier. With aging, we lose water in this bound state. And you can imagine or think about the bones becoming, in a sense, a little dehydrated. And when they become dehydrated, they become a lot more brittle. And that can increase the potential of bone fracture. So one of the reasons that bones become more brittle, there's a lot of geometric changes with collagen and with minerals, especially in cancellous bone. But water is also a contributing factor, or lack thereof, or lack of bound water. So this is kind of the mechanical action model I was talking about. Either it can be in the blood or it can be in the interstitial space. We think that bone cells can actually pick up fluid flow, flowing over them, sliding over them. So we call that the fluid shear. And that information can be translated into bone lining cells, or an osteocyte, or an osteoblast, or an osteoclast. And that information can go down into the DNA, where the cell can make decisions on how much collagen to produce, and how much laminin to produce, and how much minerals the bone should lay down. Okay, in introduction to the cells themselves, we're going to talk about osteoclasts, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. There are bone lining cells, which are special type of osteoblasts, but we won't talk about them that much. So the way remodeling works in bones, if there's a cooperative effort between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So the entire idea, and like an HGTV television show, you tear out the old and bad and broken stuff first, and you put down new and better material. So this is a stain of a real osteoclast over here on the left side, where it's chewing up bone material. This looks to me like it's fairly dense, but I think it's cancellous bone, because it does have these non-mineralized areas, but fairly dense stuff. So the osteoclast is going to dig a tunnel. Then osteoblasts are going to come right behind them and deposit new bone material. So osteoblasts and osteoclasts cooperate, they work together. Osteocytes kind of keep, it's like getting an email or a text from your boss telling you what to do. The osteocytes will barge in every once in a while and harass them. But for the most part, the workers themselves, the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, know what to do. They have receptors for estrogen, testosterone. They can detect what's going on with the environment. So the osteoclast is going to chew up old material and resorb it. So it's going to squirt, here's some acid here. It's going to squirt some acid. It's going to squirt some chloride. So that means Clorox. So it's like acid, Clorox, here's citric acid, some additional acid. There are a number of enzymes that can digest collagen. So that's another thing that's going on. So you've got enzymes, you've got acid, you got Clorox, you got all kinds of stuff that's working on the protein and the mineral content of the bone you're trying to digest. So these are large cells, they're multinucleated. Osteoblasts will come right behind them. This is a protein, a transcription factor called RANKL, which is often on the surface, then it can translocate to the nuclei. That's a way we communicate. RANKL can actually turn on an osteoclast. So this osteoblast is saying, go ahead and repair that area of the bone that's been damaged, and I'll come right behind you and fix things up. So indeed, they kind of talk together. Osteoclasts are cousins of white blood cells called macrophages. In fact, sometimes macrophages can turn into osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are slightly related to, believe it or not, platelets and red blood cells. Here we go. Here's an osteoblast. This is a stain of a real osteoblast. They're smaller, a lot smaller than osteoclasts. They have a single nucleus. They also have receptors for hormones. For example, with osteoclasts, estrogen will actually reduce or inhibit osteoclasts from chewing up old bone. They do so through NADPH oxidases. that we're going to talk about later, like NOX2 and NOX1. And there's this protein called RANKL, which is involved in activating the osteoclasts. And those are going to be the targets that we use today for drugs to treat osteoporosis. So this is one of the reasons you may wonder, well, why is this chemistry important? Because we're able to identify which proteins are important in different diseases. And once we know that, then we can target them with drugs. And also when we're studying the effects of exercise, because with rehabilitation, with just about any type of orthopedic injury and any type of orthopedic malady, including arthritis, exercise is usually a therapeutic strategy that's used to try to deal with it. So we want to know how exercise works, and then how the drugs work, and then how they can work together. In fact, oftentimes they can work synergistically. This is definitely true with exercise in preventing osteoporosis and healing injuries to bones, tendons, ligaments, cartilage. We know now exercise is important. Didn't know that 40 years ago, or we kind of did, but we weren't using it. So with osteoblasts, they're small cells, their progenitor cells also come from the bone marrow. They can detect changes in mechanical stress and strain. So they come from mesenchymal stem cells, and the progenitor cells go into the blood, and then they become an osteoblast. Osteocytes can coordinate with osteoblasts. Their job is to produce more collagen and deposit more minerals. And as I mentioned, they're going to work together with osteoclasts. Once these osteoclasts are clear of an area in cancellous bone, or they've dug a tunnel through cortical bone, then osteoblasts will come right behind them and deposit new calcium and new collagen. So in the bone remodeling strategy, there are two phases. And I would contend this is also true for tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. It's just in each of those tissues, the same cell is actually doing both the protein degradation and the protein synthesis. In the case of bones, we actually have different workers doing different things. So in the case of resorption, osteoclasts come in first, digest material with enzymes, with Clorox, right over here, with acids, digest it out. Osteoblasts come behind. The problem we see with aging, and some of this is sedentary lifestyle, some of this is reduction in hormones, especially estrogen in women, but also in men, growth hormone, as well as testosterone, testosterone. I was thinking about IGF-1, but that's not a hormone. Testosterone, those are decreased with aging. And when that happens, osteoclast activity gets to be too high. They start tearing up too much stuff. The osteoblast can't keep up. And that's why bones lose mass, change their geometry, become a lot more brittle. You lose a lot of water. So one of the questions is, are the progenitor cells for osteoblasts, are they not working as well? That seems to be the case, but it doesn't seem to be true, at least in bones up to probably age 80, that there aren't enough progenitor cells. The problem is activating them. In fact, I just saw a study where they used, I think it was serum or blood from a young person or a very young animal, and they exposed old bone cells to that new environment, and they started working like they were supposed to, just like that. And this included the progenitor cells. So in this remodeling process, osteoclasts come in first, chew out the old material. Osteoblasts come in next, deposit new calcium, new minerals, and make it better. Okay, so I've got, let's see if this works for an embedded.
If this blow hit you, it could shatter bones, trigger hemorrhaging.
Okay, so we're going to look at an extreme example of the remodeling process with karate, with martial arts. We know that the bones of in the arms and legs of people who do martial arts, because they have these extremely high impact forces, and the slope, if you will, the change in force is really super steep. We think it's actually the change in slope that actually stimulates remodeling. It's just not the height of the load itself. It's it going up really fast and then coming back down. So with karate, you're going to see that.
And damage vital organs. The body truly is a weapon. On the impact criteria, it scored a knockout.
Oh, yeah.
But how did he do it? Human long bones are like drinking straws, hollow in the middle and stronger on the long axis, weaker when bent. They are softest, called spongy bone on the ends.
That would have broken the normal person's hands. So we know that there's some type of bone remodeling going on.
That's the secret. Hard body training actually transforms the bone itself. It's called Wolff's Law, based on the pioneering discoveries of 19th century surgeon Julius Wolff. These are the structures in human bone. Trabeculi, Latin for little beams. When bones are traumatized.
So the trabeculi, those respond to exercise, but it's the trabeculi that are also lost with aging, with space flight, sedentary lifestyle, osteoporosis.
Over and over, they lay down more calcium structures, more little beams. The bones become denser, harder, more durable. Ancient martial artists knew the secret of Wolff's Law long before modern science. For centuries, they've trained by breaking boards, striking sand, iron, stone. That which does not kill you really does make you stronger.
All right.
If this blow hit you, it could...
There we go. That wasn't too bad. Kind of worked. Except, I think... Now I have to advance. Okay. I'm going to have to move this a second. I'm going to move this over and kind of reset here. There we go. So I think we can move on. Osteocytes are mature osteoblasts. So they're former osteoblasts that have been entrapped in bone material. They're supervisors of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They have projections that can help detect inflammation, the chemical environment, hormonal environment, growth factors, microtrauma, stress, but they also communicate with each other. So it's like their grid, their cell phone lines, if you will, or cable lines. Cable. So yesterday we got rid of cable ourselves. Best move we made. We're on YouTube TV and streaming stuff now. So in terms of organic stuff, besides the cells, the proteins become important. So we're going to talk about collagen, which is the main one. Come on. Okay. So this is a little cartoon of a collagen molecule. So a collagen molecule, believe it or not, is a little bit like the protein in your hair called keratin. So keratin and collagen are triple helix. They have 3 strands of amino acids and they're twisted around each other. And that provides a significant amount of strength, particularly in tension. It can deal with bending forces as well. The 3 strands, and then in between collagen molecules, we have cross-linking, usually at 2 amino acids called lysine and hydroxylysine. Sometimes they're between hydroxylysine molecules. So these cross-links provide stiffness in collagen. So it's a right-handed triple helix, works a bit like your hair protein called keratin. However, it's a lot stronger than keratin. The strength of collagen at the molecular level is actually more like Kevlar, which is the really hard plastic that you see in football helmets, for example. Here we go. So the interesting and unusual thing about collagen, instead of having all 20 essential amino acids and a few more, they mostly have the same ones repeated over and over. Yeah, there are a few other amino acids that sneak in there. But because you have a right-handed triple helix and it needs to be super strong and stiff, you have some unique amino acids. One is glycine. Glycine only has 2 carbons. It's really small. It's there so the helix can turn. So you can get that twisting of the fibers around each other. Proline, and especially hydroxyproline, are there to provide strength. In humans, guinea pigs, and a few other animals, you need vitamin C, ascorbic acid, to be able to convert proline. So you can get proline in your diet, also glycine, also lysine, but your body has to make hydroxyproline. And you guys probably, I'm sure, remember the disease that happens when people don't have enough ascorbic acid or vitamin C. Scurvy, scurvy. So sailors often have lemons, limes, oranges, other types of citrus fruit with them back in the day, so they made sure that they had sufficient amount of vitamin C. So vitamin C you also need for your immune system, but it's also incredibly, incredibly important in terms of the production of collagen. So scurvy, you'd have problems with the gums, joints, bones were soft, etc. You also need the collagen molecule and the mesh that you see in bones to be strong. And there's an enzyme called lysyl oxidase that converts lysine to hydroxylysine. So hydroxyproline, hydroxylysine, you really can't get in your diet. Your body has to make them. So lysyl oxidase not only converts lysine to hydroxylysine, it helps to form those cross links that help to keep collagen really stiff. So each of those amino acids has their own unique function. Glycoproteins and proteoglycans do lots of stuff. They bind to water along with collagen and the minerals. That bound water turns out to be incredibly important in ductility, in strength, in communication of mechanical stress, and also we think now in the healing process. So believe it or not, there's a lot of research going on. Hydrogel technology that we've talked about a little bit, and we'll get into some more, is sort of based on this idea. Proteoglycans can store lots of aqueous stuff because they're highly charged. And that means they are able to basically not only store water, but they're able to bind to collagen, they're able to bind to integrins, they're able to communicate information, and they're able to communicate and use chemicals and hormones and communicate that information and respond to it. So we really think in tendons and ligaments that they're incredibly important in the healing process. We think so with bones. Maybe with skeletal muscle, there hasn't been as much research with skeletal muscle and proteoglycans. Bone marrow. So as we mentioned, it's contained in the medullary cavity in children. In adults, that's filled with yellow marrow, which is made of adipose. Adipose, by the way, the fatty acids or the fat content is actually white in color, just like, for example, a candle that doesn't have any dye in it is white. That's standard candle. Or wax, if you think about wax technically is white. Adipose is yellow because it has a preservative. Remember, your body's 98.6 is 100% humidity. If butter or margarine's at 98.6, like a typical day outside, and we put some butter or margarine out in the sidewalk, it's going to melt, turn brown and rancid really fast. So that's a good reason to try to lose weight. Because things can go rancid. That's not a good thing. Now you'll probably want to, you had that extra piece of cake or you have some ice cream, you might want to have some carrots, because the yellow marrow is yellow because of beta carotene. Beta carotene is actually a preservative. So I actually have some carrots in the refrigerator that are kind of yellow orange, but they're also red, and there's some maroon ones, some Aggie carrots. Maroon carrots were first made here at Texas A&M. Red marrow, of course, produces red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, osteoclasts, osteoblasts, all kinds of stem cells So your bone marrow is incredibly important. Last thing we want to talk about, again, here's the bone marrow producing lots of different types of stem cells for all different kinds of tissues, from skin to skeletal muscle to the heart to the liver, everything else. The periosteum is a layer on the outside of bones. We actually see something like this. There's a visceral layer that's on top of tendons and ligaments. This is where the blood supply is in bones, tendons, and ligaments. This is where the nerve supply is. There are lots of canals or tunnels that have been dug into bone. So you do have lots of small arterioles and capillaries sneak into the bone and feed it, and some small arteries as well. Whereas you don't really see that as much with tendons and ligaments. But the most perfused area of a bone or tendon or ligament is on the outside. In bones, we call this the periosteum. It's just usually a couple of layers thick. And here you see, actually, I think this is a blood vessel that's branching and coming into the periosteum. Then you see the hard bone material right underneath it with a canal. This is probably some cortical bone because it looks like it's probably in the shaft. So the other thing about periosteum, it's a source of stem cells, osteo for osteoblasts and osteoclasts. If there's an injury or bruise right around here, you'll see those stem cells produce no new bone material. There's a downside to that. If you hit a bone really hard, you can get a bone bruise. It can form a thickened area, which can cause some discomfort, a bone spur. I had a bone spur, I forgot, I think it was my right elbow. I hit it way back when I was about 20 years of age. It took about 30 years for it to disappear, but I think it's finally gone. I don't know if that means I had bone mass loss, hopefully not. But after about 30 years, it finally disappeared, but it took a while. For someone, though, with arthritis, when there's an injury to the articular cartilage and it starts to wear away, and you have bone grinding on bone, you can have loss of bone mass in the joint, but you can also have production of new bone mass. And so, like, the fingers get disfigured, so does the knee, and that makes things even worse, and you get more pain and discomfort. So, as I mentioned, with bone construction, we have epiphysis, diaphysis, articular cartilage. Here's what we see with the humerus. We have articular cartilage, that cancellous or spongy bone. The non-mineralized areas right in here, that's where the red marrow is in an adult. The medullary cavity in adults is mostly yellow, so it's adipose, it's fat. Cancellous bone has a higher surface area because there's more, I can click on this, there we go. Go back. It has a higher surface area because there's more non-mineralized bone. So each non-mineralized area has a surface. That's where you can put a lot of blood vessels. That's where the blood supply is. The greater the blood supply, the greater the metabolism. So metabolism's higher, protein turnover is higher in this kind of bone versus cortical bone, which is denser, but just doesn't turn over as fast. So the material is lighter. It's not as strong. You'd say it might be more likely to be injured. We make up for it partly by the fact that the material is wider. So that means force per cross-sectional area. We increase the cross-sectional area to make up for the fact that it can't quite handle as much stress. And it also adapts faster to mechanical stress and strain, either direction. With exercise training, it adapts faster. With casting, space flight, it also adapts faster in the opposite direction. And that's why it's cancellous bone that's mostly affected by long-term sedentary lifestyle and aging. And I mentioned them together because what we think of in terms of muscle mass loss and bone mass loss is really a combination of sedentary lifestyle, aging, along with sometimes chronic disease, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, etc. They can all contribute, believe it or not, to bone mass loss or inadequate amount of bone mass. So these are kind of some old stains, old pictures. Cancellous bone, you can see where it's non-mineralized, you have this surface area, lots of surface where we can place blood vessels, but also it's basically a lining, or I guess an edge, if you will, where osteoblasts and osteoclasts can go to work. Cortical bone is really thick, it's dense, so it's like a lot of dinner plates stacked on top of each other. So I've got a Frisbee. So imagine I have a stack of Frisbees. And this stack of Frisbees, between each Frisbee, I've got some blood vessels. Around the Frisbees, I have blood vessels in the stack. And then we've actually dug some holes into the Frisbees. And there's additional channels or tunnels where we have blood flow. Cortical blood flow is the cortical bone is very dense. It doesn't have as much blood flow. Where do we have a lot of cortical bone? In the shaft of long bones. Also the carpal bones of your hand, metacarpal, metatarsal, and tarsal bones of the feet. And when they get a fracture, that bone doesn't heal as fast. It doesn't have as much nutrient blood supply. And actually physicians, orthopedic surgeons get really concerned about that. Sometimes they'll put a screw in it. Someday we'll be able to introduce, besides exercise training, biologicals that will actually help the healing process. And that's why we're starting to look at some of these target proteins that we've been talking about. Maybe increase nitric oxide synthase, maybe reduce cytokines a little bit. So in terms of organization, again, if you can imagine stacks of dinner plates make up, or each dinner plate is like what we would call an osteon, a bone unit. And stacks of them, stack after stack, makes up this dense cortical bone. So here's an osteon with its tunnels or canals, lamellae, caniculi. That allows blood vessels, blood flow, to be able to get into the bone and feed it. And when people are exercising, believe it or not, the blood flow to your femur increases. The blood flow to your tibia increases. The bones in your foot. So it's not just for muscles and heart and your brain. Actually, connected tissues also see an increase in blood flow. There may be stimulus through mechanotransduction to increasing protein turnover. Here we see, back again, the neck of the femur. So the neck of the femur is made up of cancellous bone. This is Ward's triangle. This area, the neck of the femur, that's what we get worried about when people get older. As that material starts to thin out and the trabeculi are disrupted, or you lose some of the trabeculi, then the bone not only becomes weaker, becomes a lot more brittle. And also the bone is losing bound waters, becoming dehydrated, if you will. And dehydrated bone becomes more brittle. It's not as tough. In fact, when people are testing bone material using an Instron machine, they actually have to keep the bone hydrated before the test, just to make sure that it hasn't lost any of its material or mechanical properties. So you wouldn't think water makes bone strong and makes it ductile and makes it less likely to get a fracture, but indeed that's the case. So here we see, I should point this out, really thick cancellous bone. This is what you want. This is where exercise training can help. Anisotropic nature of bones. Anisotropic doesn't mean, man, I'd like to be in a desert island by now, or maybe I'd like to be back on the beach, back with a lot of people. Unfortunately, we can't right now. Anisotropic, so we're not hanging out at the beach. An means not. Iso means the same. Tropic or trophic just means function. So what it means is that the function or the material, for bones, the function is really the material or mechanical properties. It's really the health of a bone, tendon, ligament, or cartilage. so that we could say the function of the bones is not the same for different loads or different types of mechanical stressors, meaning that bones don't have the same strength with compression as they do with tension, as they do with bending, and as they do with shear or chopping forces. So here's bone strength. I think this was measured in the tibia. Compression, bones are much, much stronger in compression. A typical tibia or femur in an adult human can store about 2,000 pounds of force before it breaks, probably over 1 ton, over 2,000 pounds. Can handle about 1,400 pounds in tension. Your muscles are tugging on bones all the time. They see a lot of tension. Especially in the lower body, you actually don't see that much shear force, especially when you're running. When you're walking, you see some. So bones are weakest against shear force. So even if it takes over 1 ton in compression to break a tibia or a femur, it's going to take only 400 or 500 pounds of shear force to do that. You combine that with compression, you can get a compound fracture. That's why football tackle can do that when you're generating, 500, 1,000, 1,500 pounds. Only Dominican Sue can generate 1.5 tons. But especially when it's in shear, you don't need a huge amount of force to do that. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what we're going to do is look at some stress strain curves. One is for compression. That's the one right here. And then the other one is for shear. So for compressive stress, the bones again are strongest. But also if we look at the slope of the line, that's in the elastic region. That tells us about stiffness. The steeper the slope, the stiffer the material is. And the slope is the change in the y variable, stress, divided by the change in the x variable, or strain. So the stiffness is greater, the strength is greater. That's the maximal stress before it breaks. So the strength is about twice as much, about 30% higher in stiffness. And then when we look at how much strain happens before the failure point, before things completely break, notice that with compression, that the bone can be compressed a greater distance or greater strain before it breaks. That tells us about ductility. The greater the strain, the more ductile the material. Glass, for example, would have a line that's really super steep because glass, believe it or not, is strong. It's stiff, but it's got virtually no ductility. It shatters. One of the things about brittle materials is they shatter. They break into small pieces when they become badly injured. So remember, this is the same bone. We're not comparing different bones. The same bone. So it's not just that the bone is weaker against shear force. It's also not as stiff. It's also not as ductile, meaning it's more brittle. So it's softer against the shear force. It's weaker, and it's also more brittle. If we combine all of that and basically look at the area under the curve, which is the toughness, oh gosh, that's about 20% of the toughness in compression. About 20%, it looks like to me. So that means, first of all, that bone is way more likely to be fractured with a shear force than with a large compressive force. Secondly, when there is a fracture, when a large shear force is involved, you're more likely to have a more complex fracture, like a compound fracture. And when it fractures, it's more likely to shatter, or it's more likely to break into pieces, causing the surgeon to have to put maybe a rod in or a pin in, etc. So it's not good news at all. So that's what you have to watch. That's why people wear shin guards, because if you can get kicked in the shin hard enough, you can actually get a fracture. And it could be a really bad fracture. Let's say you have your foot planted and the other one's in the air, and someone kicks you from the front or kicks you from the inside. and that foot hits right in the middle of the shin or the tibia, you can definitely get a big time fracture. And bones are anisotropic, and as well as tendons, ligaments, cartilage, and even muscles, because they see different types of loads in different ways. So the bone sees a lot more compression when people are walking and running. It does see some tension when muscles are contracting. We don't see as much shear, except, believe it or not, when you're walking, you see a little bit more shear in the spine and in the bones in the legs. Okay, so let's talk about regulation of bone growth and loss and leading up to bone injuries. And I think we'll pick up with bone injuries and osteoporosis and exercise next time in the second half of our discussion about bone. So mechanical stress and strain is the main thing that affects osteoblasts and osteoclast activity. And it's the activity of the cells that determine how much protein and minerals the bones actually have. So what are other things that modify this? Well, you need enough calcium in your diet. That's critical. 90% of, sorry, I was trying to click off. I get, as we're going along, I get notifications. I try to turn as many of them off as possible. And sometimes they lead to my internet popping up. Pardon me. Okay. Calcium. Most people don't get enough calcium. And one of the things to remember about calcium, unlike fats and carbohydrates and amino acids, it's a micronutrient, and most micronutrients you absorb only a fraction, 20, 30, 40, 50% or so, depending upon the type of nutrient. Calcium is critical to heart, brain, neurons, muscle cells in the heart and the skeletal muscle. We have to maintain calcium levels really tightly in the body, but only about 1/3 of the calcium is absorbed. So what can we do about that? Well, vitamin D can increase the amount of calcium that can be absorbed. So vitamin D is critical, getting that every day, either through ultraviolet light. Like I said, this is a good time to be in your backyard. Today was great. Outside, I was outside for a while. That's why it's dark now, because I was doing a little bit of yard work. I'm actually going to try to get a little bit of exercise done after this, but I've got a couple of deadlines by midnight Eastern time. Most Americans are not getting enough calcium in their diet. So here's what you need. It's really about 12 to 1,500 milligrams for everybody. Someone your age, minimum 1,200 milligrams per day. That's basically the equivalent of 2 large glasses of milk. It can be Utopia chocolate milk or dairy products, and a normal diet will get you there. But 12 to 1,500 milligrams is a really good idea. This is where we're maxing on bone formation. So this would be part of primary prevention. Women who are pregnant, or as people get older, especially for women who are postmenopausal, and for everybody after age 65, you really need to get close to 1,500 milligrams per day. So people need calcium throughout the lifespan. How can we get it? Well, you can get it from supplements, or you can get it the old-fashioned way from milk and dairy products. It doesn't matter what type of milk. It can be chocolate milk, white milk, low-fat, skim milk. Doesn't really matter. It's close to 300. I think skim milk is slightly more calcium, believe it or not, than whole milk. That's because there's a bit of fat in whole milk, and so the fat content doesn't have any calcium in it. Yogurt, of course, most dairy products, particularly milk, are fortified with vitamin D. It's added on. Yogurt's got about 350. Cheese can vary, but for 4 ounces can be anywhere from like 150 to 500 milligrams. They have calcium fortified orange juice. Leafy green vegetables like collard greens have a significant amount of calcium. Spinach, so Popeye was right. Popeye the Sailor Man. Most meat, like steak, chicken, most fish, don't have a lot of calcium. It's only fish where the skeleton is made of cartilage. So sardines, sharks, believe it or not, actually have a high level of calcium in the muscles. Most of the time, most of the calcium is in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When the muscle becomes meat, if it is beef or chicken or most fish, there's really no calcium left in it. It's gone. Can you use a calcium supplement? Sure can. It actually works almost as well as it being in the food. This is a case where you can actually say the supplement actually works pretty nicely. If you're worried about whether your calcium supplement dissolves or not, almost all of them will dissolve really readily. The toughest one to dissolve is calcium carbonate, not surprisingly. But what you need to do is see if it'll dissolve in a dilute acid. This is vinegar. Your body, of course, in your stomach, you're producing hydrochloric acid. That's basically how you break down the compounds that have calcium in them so that the small intestine can absorb them. If you have a glass of vinegar and put your supplement in there, and if it dissolves in 10 to 20 minutes, we've done this before in class where I would just throw them in. Yeah, I've never had a case where it didn't work, especially even with calcium carbonate. So you can check that out. Regulation of bone growth and loss. Vitamin D, we mentioned, is really super important. You can get vitamin D, and it'll be activated vitamin D with ultraviolet light with the skin, or you can absorb it in the diet, and then it has to be activated, believe it or not, by parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid gland is right here in the neck, right above, or it's actually on top of your thyroid gland. Parathyroid travels down to the kidney, where it meets up with vitamin D and then activates it. Once vitamin D is activated, then it dramatically increases calcium absorption in the intestine. Hormones are incredibly important, not surprisingly. Both estradiol and testosterone have receptors on osteoclasts and osteoblasts. For women, estrogen is critically important because through its receptors on osteoclasts as well as osteoblasts. With osteoclasts, it reduces reabsorption. It basically keeps those osteoclasts from chewing up too much material. So you limit excess resorption. Estradiol does increase protein synthesis. Most people wouldn't think so, but it does increase protein synthesis in bones as well as connective tissue, other connective tissues. And with the osteoblasts, it does so by increasing the effect on key growth factors, especially insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1. Transforming growth factor, which also helps to produce collagen, it's increased as well by estrogen. Estrogen, of course, is derived from cholesterol. It's an anabolic steroid. After menopause, or with a female athlete triad that we'll talk about next time, there is a huge decrease in estrogen. When that happens, it's not bound to its receptors on osteoclasts and osteoblasts, and that means protein degradation goes way up, protein synthesis goes down, and the bones lose mass at a rapid rate. Here we go. Next, we'll talk about hormones that directly regulate the amount of calcium in the blood. There's calcitonin, and we just talked about parathyroid hormone a little bit. Calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, and it's activated when calcium levels rise. So you have a meal with a significant amount of calcium, or maybe you've taken some supplements. When those calcium levels rise in the blood, calcitonin is released by the thyroid gland, and it has potent anti-resorptive effects on osteoclasts, and you're focusing on bone building. So it greatly increases through insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, collagen synthesis, and deposition of minerals. We used to use calcitonin significantly against osteoporosis. It's a relatively small peptide, about 30 or so amino acids, and you could use it as a nasal spray. Believe it or not, the capillaries in your nose can absorb something like a small peptide, and it will get through the blood-brain barrier and get into circulation. where you can basically use it systemically. So we can get it through basically those capillaries in your nostrils, really in your nasal passages. And as it spikes, as calcitonin increases, it's going to take that calcium from the blood, deposit in the bone. So what you're doing is calcitonin deposits money, calcium, into the bone bank. That's what we want. Keep those deposits, not like my checking account right now. Keep those deposits coming into the bone bank. And exercise will help do that as well. It helps to spike growth hormone. It helps keep some of these hormones like calcitonin really doing its job in terms of protein synthesis and remodeling. Parathyroid hormone sort of does the opposite of calcitonin, but not really. What we mean is that when calcium levels drop, parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid gland. So you might think, well, all it's going to do is take calcium from the bones. That's not the first thing it's going to do, though. What it's going to do initially is try to activate vitamin D in their J cells that are in the kidney, where the activation occurs. Then the active vitamin D travels to the small intestine, where it increases the amount of calcium resorption. Parathyroid hormone also increases renal reabsorption of calcium so that you don't pee out as much. With that extra retention and increase in the amount of absorption, that sometimes is enough to maintain calcium levels. And when it's has a spike and then it goes back down, especially after you have a nice meal with calcium in it, then parathyroid hormone actually stimulates osteoblast through insulin-like growth factor. So this is an intermittent effect. So during the course of the day, you'll have a PTH spike, then you'll have a nice meal where you have calcium levels. That up and down, that oscillation actually stimulates osteoblasts through IGF-1 to deposit more bone minerals and more collagen. So it's the opposite of what you might think. And you put that with vitamin D, then you got a significant amount of bone mass increase through PTH. So believe it or not, PTH is sometimes low in some women with osteoporosis. And we used to use PTH therapy as a treatment for osteoporosis. We don't as much anymore. We have a number of alternative drugs that we can use. However, if PTH goes up and stays up because you're not getting calcium in your diet over a week or two or a month, etc., then it's going to stimulate osteoclast. And you're going to start to break into the bank, break into that savings account. Oh no. Growth hormone. Growth hormone is incredibly important, released by the pituitary gland. And it's not just for longitudinal growth, getting taller. It's also important for maintaining muscle mass. It helps to maintain bone mass, tendon mass, ligament mass, possibly even cartilage. When people are exercising, you get this huge spike in growth hormone. I was looking at an ad from, I think it was Nugenics, that said if you take this new product, this new special product, you can increase growth hormone by 100%. Exercise can increase growth hormone levels. They'll spike in your blood by 500 or 600%, not 100%. So you can do 5 times what the supplement can do just by exercising. That makes me want to go out there right now. It's too bad I got deadlines coming up. Oh my gosh. So we're going to stop here pretty soon. I think after we're done with some of these hormones, etc., we'll probably talk about bone injuries here coming up next time. So we're going to work on that tomorrow. So again, growth hormones released by the pituitary gland. It increases protein synthesis, but it can't do it directly. It has to do so through intermediaries. They used to be called somatomedins. Today we call them growth factors. Insulin-like growth factor, transforming growth factor. Platelet-derived growth factor also can be stimulated by growth hormone. You get these huge increases with exercise, up to 500%. It's intensity dependent. The more intense the exercise, the greater the release in growth hormone. The longer the exercise, the greater the release in growth hormone. Once you're in good shape, let's say you become more physically fit, you get a bigger spike in growth hormone. Most hormones don't work like that at all. So this is really unusual. Growth hormone is the friend of your muscles and your bones. Yeah, you could go for the needle or a supplement or something like that, but you know what? The best way to increase your growth hormone levels is to exercise. Okay, thyroxine, thyroid hormones, T4, there are 4 iodine atoms on, there are actually 2 tyrosines. So I'll have to make that plural. It's produced by the thyroid gland, involved in protein synthesis and metabolism. Most of the time, people's thyroid levels are pretty good, but sometimes with autoimmune diseases, Hashimoto's, you get hypothyroidism. Graves' disease, you get hyperthyroidism. Both of them produce antibodies on different proteins. One of them, I think, is tyrosine peroxidase, and that's what Graves' disease, no, I'm sorry, that's what Hashimoto's goes after, and that slows down the production of thyroxine or T4. In the body, T3, which has 3 iodine atoms, that actually is the active form of your thyroid hormone, and that can increase with exercise a little bit. So that may actually stimulate the remodeling process after exercise, because you see a spike in T4 and T3. Pharmaceutical agents can interfere with bone mass. So antacids, especially the aluminum or magnesium salts, increase the pH in the stomach. You actually need hydrochloric acid to break down the calcium either in a supplement or in your food. Corticosteroids like cortisone or prednisone are catabolic steroids. They basically tear down muscle and bone, and they use the amino acids to actually produce glucose through gluconeogenesis. So like cortisone and prednisone, they're very powerful anti-inflammatory agents. So physicians still use them for autoimmune diseases, used to use them a lot for rheumatoid arthritis, for example, which technically is a type of autoimmune disease. But these corticosteroids have a steroid structure. It's not anabolic, it's catabolic. That's similar to cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Its job is to produce new glucose and deposit it into the blood. It does the opposite of what insulin does. It's sometimes called an insulin antagonist. Insulin takes glucose from the blood, deposits that glucose into a muscle or bone or tendon or a ligament. Cortisol does the opposite. It forces your liver to produce new glucose through gluconeogenesis. And where does it get the substrate to produce glucose? Well, that's going to come from amino acids from muscles and bones. When people go on a severe diet, it actually causes the body some stress. Cortisol levels go up. Due to that and a number of other reasons, the body actually tries to protect the fat, but it doesn't protect your bones and muscles as well, and doesn't protect the glycogen as well. So you actually can lose a significant amount of weight the first week or two. Most of that is water due to glycogen breakdown or loss of lean mass. So that's not the way, unfortunately, to lose weight. With development and aging, both can have effect on bones. As we develop, we increase bone mass. Bones get thicker, denser, stronger. They go from being made of mostly of ossified cartilage to ossified hard bone material. They get tougher. So children are susceptible to fractures. Young adults, not as much, except for obviously during contact sports. As people get older, they start to lose mass, and the bones get more brittle, more likely to be injured. So the young and the elderly are most susceptible to fractures, but for much different reasons. Young people have soft bones, they're not very strong, they're not very tough, but they're very ductile. So the chance of a green stick fracture are high. For older people, the bones are weaker, but they're a lot more brittle. And therefore, they're not as tough. When the bones break, they're more likely to shatter. And the healing process is very, very, very slow. So I think the last thing we'll look over is a couple of slides related to aging in bones. So the tools we have in humans are bone scans. We fortunately done lots of animal studies that have told us about the effects of aging, exercise, rehabilitation, sedentary lifestyle, cortisol, cortisone, all the things that we've been talking about and will talk about that affect bone mass. So we actually have an idea when people take a bone scan, what does it mean in terms of material properties? Because we can equate that with what's happened in animal studies where we can use an Instron machine and actually do mechanical testing on bones. So for example, within maybe 6 months to a year of weight training, you can get 3, maybe 5, 6% increase in bone mineral density or bone mineral content. When that happens, it usually equates to about a 10% increase in mechanical strength. So we have an idea of what that means from a mechanical standpoint and therefore a clinical or health standpoint. So we have a number of bone scans, special X-ray DEXA machine that you see here, photon absorptiometry. We've got PET scans, positron emission tomography, QCT stands. That means quantitative tomography, and that can do whole bone or individual tissues. So the bone scans are critical. We try to ideally build peak bone mass for someone in their 20s. With exercise training and the right type of diet, enough calories, enough calcium, you can actually see a further increase in a young adult, maybe until about 50 years of age, especially if you continue to be really active. Then we see a drop off. For some people, it's about 30. Some people, it's about 40. For some people, it's about 50. After age 50, everybody is starting to lose bone mass. This can be modified, again, tremendously by the amount of exercise you get, the calorie intake, which needs to be sufficient, calcium intake, which also needs to be sufficient. So in the end, it looks something like we skipped one. There we go. So the greatest loss of bone mass seems to be between around ages 50 to 65 years of age. Menopause in women is usually in the early 50s. It takes place over a number of years. And so estrogen levels go from being normal in a young adult, and they drop about 90%. There are some estrogen receptor modulators that people can take, or hormone replacement. We don't do the hormone replacement as much as we used to. It's expensive. And in some people, if it's estrogen, it can increase the risk of both cancer and even, believe it or not, heart attacks. It doesn't really level off after you get to be 70, but you can see there's a big scatter. Some of this is genetic, some of this is exercise, some of this is luck. And then some people are really sick or really frail. So it can vary a lot, but we think it slows down at about age 65. And so what we'd like to do is build up more peak bone mass, maintain it or increase it to age 40 or 50, and then slow down the rate of bone mass loss. It does continue to be reduced after age 70. So what we want to do is keep it away from a critical threshold. And if we hit that critical threshold, the chances of an osteoporotic fracture are greater. So this is where we get into, remember we talked about the Center for Disease Control. It has another name or additional name, and that's prevention. CDCP, no one uses the P. So we can have two phases that we can talk about of prevention. Primary prevention, where we're trying to build peak bone mass. With diet, with exercise, we can increase the amount of bone mass in someone's teenage years. Teenagers sometimes don't like to exercise. They like to play video games. They eat kind of funny. They don't like to drink milk anymore. So getting enough calcium, enough calories, sometimes the quality of the calories is an issue as well. And then with secondary prevention, if we can maintain that bone mass for a longer period of time and or increase it further with exercise training. Every year someone continues to exercise or train, we see an increase in the amount of bone mass. It's really pretty interesting. So if we can do all the right things, build more peak bone mass, maintain it for longer, and then during the treatment phase, if we can slow down the slope, we never reach that critical bone mass and we don't get osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is a disease. Genetics plays a role, no question about it, but we can do a lot to prevent it and reduce the risk. So that's a pretty good message, I think, to end up on. So we'll talk about the effects of aging as well as development in children on mechanical properties starting next time. And that's just how you live. We'll stop for today. Take it all, but you never give. Should've known you was trouble from the first kiss. Well, the message for here is give, pay forward whenever you can. Help out yourself, help out your family, help others as we go through these trying times. Anything you can do to make the day easier for you. This is a reminder for me later in this week. I don't want to cook, and my wife doesn't want to cook. So we're gonna, I think we won't eat out, but we're going to send out and either get a delivery or go get it ourselves. So support all of your local vendors, whether it's food or otherwise, and try to help each other. Stay cool. We've had some great weather today and a little bit yesterday. The next couple days are going to be fantastic, so enjoy them. We have a test coming up in a couple of days. Really quickly, I've sent you guys an email. Looks like we're probably going to use eCampus, and it's probably going to be a Word document. I'm going to try a mock test tomorrow. The day's been crazy, and also I've been trying to work through some of these slides and get them prepared for this type of delivery, which is a little different than standing in front of you, but I'm kind of enjoying this. So we will see you next time. You guys have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.